Hello everyone, welcome to Taiwan Bar. Today we're going to talk about the transition Taiwan went through after the Qing Dynasty, how a paradise for the indigenous people became a society dominated by the Chinese. In 1683, Emperor Kangxi of the Qing Dynasty sent Shilang to wipe out the Zheng family. Kangxi couldn't figure out what to do with Taiwan, to keep it or discard it. What should we do with it? A few politicians proposed to keep it, but the majority thought that Taiwan was insignificant, Taiwan didn't matter much. Let it go, let it go. But, after some serious thinking, Shilang realized Taiwan's potential, its strategic location, its abundance of land resources, not to mention it would rake in the cash and money would be the last thing they would have to worry about. So Shilang reported back to the emperor saying, "We can't afford to lose Taiwan. Please don't let it go." After careful deliberation, the ever-stubborn Kangxi took Shilang's advice. Opinions matter. So Kangxi made up his mind and decided to keep Taiwan. That was how Taiwan officially became a part of China's territory. But unlike in the past where Taiwan was an important global trading hub, it was, well, Mr. Emperor blocked Taiwan out from the rest of the world. With China becoming the island's sole source of information and commodities, Taiwan officially became a lone wolf. As the Qing Dynasty was mulling over Taiwan's fate, the land that was once led by the indigenous people became dominated by the Chinese. What happened in the past 2 centuries? Where were the indigenous people who used to dwell in Taiwan's western plains? Where did they go after the Chinese came? Let's dive in. As the population in China's southern coastal regions grew, more mouths had to be fed. Taiwan had naturally become the ideal place to migrate to. But can you imagine a new ruler politely asking for permission from the indigenous people? "Hi, how are you? How old are you? Where do you live? Can we stay here?" Of course not, they broke in. "I put my left foot in, I put my left foot out, I put my left foot in, and I'm gonna stay around." Didn't even have to think twice. No need to be polite. The Qing Dynasty Empire was afraid that Taiwan would turn into a hotbed of crime, so they banned immigration to Taiwan. Really? The government asked immigrants to apply for a visa, but spouses and children were forbidden to come along, etc., etc. But not everyone abode by the rules. These rules only made the immigrants more cunning. Instead of applying for hard-to-get permits, they snuck into Taiwan instead. Human traffickers made a fortune. These dirt-poor stowaways endured even more hardships. Coming to Taiwan was a life-or-death decision. Aside from the inherent dangers of crossing the strait, the immigrants weren't allowed to bring family, which meant that these newcomers were all single and lonely. Wake up! You're still single! To start a family in Taiwan was a quixotic notion. There were numerous restrictions, but in order to survive, the Chinese went with the flow as they risked their lives to make their way to Taiwan. They even brought their neighborly squabbles with them to continue where they left off. Taiwan was a tiny island and the emperor was far away. Many of the government officials who came to Taiwan had no means to do their job. Needless to say, govern the place properly. They were just here for appearance's sake. Bureaucracy! They just wanted to use Taiwan to get from rags to riches, then return to the mainland. That made the immigrants in Taiwan pissed about the government's corruption, and they stirred up a rebellion every 3 to 5 years. The early immigrants suffered greatly. The 4 books and 5 classics were burned to the ground. The practice of martial arts became commonplace. Everyone knew a kung fu move or 2. The concept of brotherhood definitely embodied the spirit of that era. Truth be told, I'm pretty confused myself with everything that happened up to this point. But please remember that the chaos that came with these Chinese immigrants affected the indigenous people the most, as that was their homeland. In the Qing Dynasty, indigenous people were called savages. In the Chinese worldview, if you share the same cultural background, you're one of their own. If not, you're a savage. For example, the uncivilized indigenous people in the Far East were labeled as Eastern savages, such as the indigenous people in Taiwan. As for those in the West, "Yo bro, you called me," they were labeled as Western savages. Aside from that, these ethnicities were categorized into immature or mature. For instance, the Miao people in Yunnan and Guizhou were obedient taxpayers, so they were labeled as mature Miao. Disobedient ones were excluded from China's territory. They were considered uncivilized, immature Miao. It was the same in Taiwan. The indigenous people who were obedient taxpayers and displayed loyalty towards the Qing Dynasty were called mature aboriginals. Mature aboriginals across all ethnic tribes had their names recorded by the government. The government even provided indigenous community schools for the mature aboriginals to receive education. Wow, in other words, Sinicization, instilling the tenets of Confucianism. As for the disobedient and other free-spirited indigenous folks, the Qing Dynasty couldn't care less whatever tribe they belonged to. The government just called them immature savages, which were regarded as the most terrifying creatures lurking in the mountains, even more ferocious than beasts. Aside from their human-like appearance, there's nothing human about them! How terrifying! To manage the new immigrants and indigenous people, the Qing Dynasty started to segregate the Chinese and indigenous people. The government drew a line and set boundaries in hope of securing living spaces for the plains indigenous peoples of Taiwan. What started as a simple stone monument expanded in size to the Tuniu Ditch, which was built during the Qianlong Emperor's rule. The ditch may sound impressive. In reality, it was just a small mud wall that was supposed to divide the two groups, with the Chinese on the left and the indigenous people on the right. The Chinese were forbidden to cross the line and cause trouble, but in reality, it was hard for the government to implement. Given that the Chinese and indigenous people's lives were so intertwined, the border was often ambiguous. In the end, it couldn't really stop those who wanted to cross the line, and so the land of the plains indigenous peoples of Taiwan gradually disappeared. The boundary meant to separate these two groups was ineffective. Hold up, let me clarify something. Rumor has it that the land of the plains indigenous peoples of Taiwan was pillaged and plundered by the terrible and abhorrent Chinese. Huh? We often hear about how the Chinese marry indigenous people for the latter's inheritance, committed contract fraud, or used force to get what they want. The Chinese brainstormed all sorts of creative ways to acquire indigenous people's land, but this is just one side of the story. Many of the indigenous people actually took the initiative to adapt to the times. They learned agriculture from the Chinese or leased their land to the Chinese, known as indigenous landlords. Sinicization was more of a means to survive instead of abandoning their identity. But we still have to recognize the fact that the Chinese did use the plains indigenous peoples. This situation worsened in the 19th century, leading to the plains indigenous peoples for mass migrations. The Qing Dynasty started to move towards the mountains to placate the indigenous people, but this gesture only brought about more conflicts, and the plains indigenous peoples were furious. In 1878, the Kavalan and Sakizaya people took arms and stood up against the Qing Dynasty, marking the onset of the Kaliawan incident. The Qing Dynasty not only sent out troops to suppress the indigenous people, they also retaliated and slaughtered the village. Young, old men and women all fell by the sword. Both tribes were nearly wiped out. The survivors hid among the Amis, Puchi's granny happens to belong to the Sakizaya tribe. With all that being said, it seems like we've only unveiled a tiny part of the story, and only partly understand what the plains indigenous peoples had been through. Many believe that the plains indigenous peoples have become extinct. Many of the Chinese intermarried the plain indigenous peoples. It's become hard to tell them apart. At the end of the day, we're all Taiwanese. Bonus points for exams! Yay! What a big misunderstanding! The bloodline is the least important thing to consider when distinguishing different ethnic groups. If you insist to factor in the bloodlines, why not just say you're East African? What really matters is the preservation of the culture. Many thought the plains indigenous people's culture had already been washed out by the Chinese culture. Take the Kavalan, for example. Their traditional language remains intact, and in 2002, they were formally recognized as a member of Taiwan's indigenous peoples. And though the Siraya still retain their religious beliefs, it's hard for the Council of Indigenous Peoples to formally recognize them as an ethnic group. Some see them more like a group of Chinese who are trying to take advantage of the government's subsidy. Many plains indigenous peoples are striving to preserve what's left of their culture amid the ongoing sinicization. Think about it. In this age of transitional justice for the indigenous people, aside from promoting propaganda, is there anything concrete that we can do? Alrighty, I'm a little bit parched after all that talking. Let me finish this millet wine. We'll see you next time around. Ganbei!